welcome to Lines and Spaces.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Michaela.
This week we will be talking a little bit about virtual recitals and virtual ensembles and virtual concerts and setting up that virtual space and putting together these type of videos that we've all seen online from all of our music friends of how those are set up within their classroom and also by themselves. And we're also gonna be doing a wrap up of our first season because sadly this is gonna be the last episode of our season one of Lion Spaces. So we'll be going into some discussion about our reflection throughout the time, things that we've learned, people that we've talked to, and the research that we've looked into, and some of our own personal experiences with having this podcast. So let's start off then by just doing some checkup. Michaela, how are you doing?
Jason, I am good. I am excited. We both start our student teaching in a few days. So that is just around the corner. How are you
Yes.
doing?
I'm in that same boat. As you know, Michaela and I are both going to our student teaching semester this coming in a couple days actually, and we're both just excited to get working, meeting our teachers that are working with in our assigned schools, and just going through that process. And it's gonna be stressful, but I'm excited about it. It's like a weird I
It's a
mean
combination of things. It's a
excitement
little
and
stressful but
fear
exciting, and
and
I
afraid
think we're both
that
nervous.
yeah. And I said this before. It was like I'm so excited, but also scared because for whatever reason, I have no idea yet. So many ideas of what I'm doing. Like throughout this break, I was like, "What do I actually do? Do I actually know how to teach?" It was like a weird sense of like, "What have I learned?" And then when the semester started revving up again, I was like, "Oh, I'm excited to do this," but also thinking about what did I learn? It's weird. It's like this odd feeling of
It's a little bit of like the syndrome. I think that we're all going through a little bit, and
yeah.
probably will go through for the beginning of student teaching at
Yes.
least.
But
But
I
really,
think,
we have all of the tools that we need to do it. Now it's just a matter of actually getting to do it.
yes, exactly. So, that's the boat that I'm in. But I think once student teaching actually starts and we get to that first day one, it's gonna be fine. And then whatever is thrown at us, we will get through it and we'll come out the other side hopefully better. All right, well, let's jump right in then. So, Michaela and I have both had a lot of experience working on and being a part of virtual ensembles, whether that's in a choral setting or an instrumental setting. So, I've done a lot of videos for my studio at Temple, 2B Phonium Studio, setting up videos over the summer and just getting acquainted with the tools that are at our disposal to putting those videos together, and also just setting up and running and organizing some of those events. So, Michaela, how would you start? Like, if you're trying to put together a virtual ensemble, like, what is the first thing that you do?
That is the question. So it kind of depends on what role you're playing in it. The role that I've played the most times was in a virtual choir. I was brought in to simply edit the videos. But if you are the music instructor, the music teacher, or the director of a group and ensemble, then you get to go back even a few more steps than I had to when you consider exactly what you want the end product to look like, and considering the ways that you need your musicians to cooperate and the things that you need them to do. So things like the way they set up their camera, how many devices they need, do they need to record on one device and listen or watch on another one? Um, Giving lighting tips and giving them tracks to be singing or playing with and things of that nature. So that's kind of the nitty gritty of the very, very first step. But moving into the actual editing process, I think Jason and I have kind of found that in working together collaboratively on some virtual choirs, he was the audio guy and I was the video person, and basically what we found worked the best was when he lined up a bass track of the vocals, so maybe one of each voice part with the instrumental accompaniment, and then he sent that to me. And while he continued to work on the rest of the audio and fine tuning it, then I got to line up all the videos. So, Jason, would you like to dive into any of that?
Yeah, so yeah, the whole process itself is it's a lot of stuff, especially with depending on the group size, the complexity of the music, and the different ins and outs of what you kind of envision. Like Michaela said, looking at like what you want the end product to be, and before we go into some of that, just like thinking about like, are you gonna edit the video or are you gonna offsource the editing to individuals, someone who has more experience in doing it? And of course, you there are different limitations for both. But for me, at least, for doing some of the audio stuff, was knowing the music, and I think that's like the key thing is like whenever you decide to put a virtual concert or virtual performance or virtual ensemble together, is choosing music that is flexible and like relatively easy to do without a conductor or like having a lot of time fluctuations, because there are some ways to get around it. So for me at least, I've been on the side of being taken in to help organize and also starting with organization, is choosing pieces that are relatively simple, for the level of group that you're with, and something that is consistent tempo wise or has like minor fluctuations of tempo, rather than pieces that have very gradual changes in tempo, like a lot of retardandos or accelerandos. So trying to steering away from those type of pieces, but doing pieces that have like really strict tempo changes. Those actually are pretty doable. Like if you start at one tempo at the beginning, and then there's like a hard tempo change, you can always just have section one, section two, section three, and then put that all together towards the end. So yeah, never for not never, but definitely look for pieces that are more strict in tempo that either stay consistent all the way through or have very direct switches of tempo throughout the piece.
Yeah,
Um,
and actually going off of that, I know that in my experience from the musician side versus the editor side, we, in a choir that I was in this past semester, we got to play around with different setups, and something that ended up working pretty well for us was our choir director had the accompaniment and a video of himself conducting throughout the entire piece. The catch to that, though, was that we needed on the singing side enough equipment to be able to set up a camera, set up another screen in which we could watch him conduct, and also have some sort of headphones or something in that was not super visible to the camera. And basically, the level of complexity to anything you're doing, virtual choir or virtual ensemble wise, it just increases significantly just because of the devices you need to be using and the things that are going on at once. So, like Jason was saying, picking out realistic repertoire is definitely a very important part of this process.
yeah, because like Michaela said, so for at least what I've gone through is I've done where we have a video of the conductor, we have a click track that we're listening to, or even we're just throwing in like, oh, here's the tempo, have a metronome on, do a count in, and then play, and then the metronome will just go on, type of thing if the tempo stays consistent. And all those what you decide to do and what you decide to have them listening to kind of is all dependent on what you have time to provide for the student and also the availability for the student to have access to all those devices. Because not everybody's going to have the ability to record off something and also watch something else, or even in general just record or have a decent quality to their sound. So that's going to be like those are kind of like the determining factors of the limitations that you can do overall. But the good thing is with editing, you can fix some of those issues in post or afterwards. So definitely, so once you choose the repertoire that you're looking at and figuring out like how you want the students to listen, that's like step number two is once you have the rep, thinking about how should the students record, what's their setup, and how are they going to record with, whether that's with a track, whether that's having a video of you conducting, or giving them a click track, or even like a MIDI track of some of the parts in the music, or just even having them play just by themselves with the metronome. And you want to figure that out relatively early so that the students know, and also so that you in your lessons can set that up for success. So that if you know they're doing a virtual ensemble, you want to start incorporating some of those points into your lessons so that the students know how to set all that up, and then finally produce the final recording for themselves.
Jason, I would love to know from two standpoints, from the musician side as well as from the editor side, what of those options did you feel worked the best in the situations you found yourself in?
Yeah, so for me, so having been on both sides, it's definitely for the performer side and sending in the videos and not doing the majority of the editing or organizing, definitely a lot easier to either have a conductor with a soundtrack of some sort they're conducting along with, so you can see and hear the music, or even just having a click track with some background noises. Doesn't have to be the entire music, but maybe just like the key melody points and just something so I for me at least, it's always more successful to have something to keep tempo and some musical reference to listen for. And then
Yeah.
from the director side, it's definitely a lot more work to get those sound files and the resources and setting up those tracks. But in the long run, I feel like that will pay off because I've done, like Michaela said earlier, we had worked together on on some virtual choir stuff, and it's definitely a lot easier to have those tracks available for the students so that they can see and hear and also go along tempo wise with the music rather than just having them, oh, here's the metronome, just sing it along with the beat that you have, because that's going to be very difficult to like fix towards the end, especially if they don't do it correctly. So definitely taking that extra time as the director or organizer to set up all these things and to keep the parameters of recording and organization very specific is going to be key to making sure that the end result and the stuff that you do at the end is not as strenuous or difficult.
Yeah, I would say getting into like it's a little bit of like a nitty gritty part of this, but something that I've learned from experience on both sides of these projects is that having some sort of a musical reference, not just a met clicking the whole time or just a conductor. Something that we found really helpful was that so in some cases we had the conductor and a piano, and we also I've discussed with some people that something that would have been very beneficial from a choir standpoint would have been having a quartet or somebody on each voice part recording and sending that out and using that as a reference track for everybody who is then going to record the virtual choir after the first few people. That way you could kind of still have the pitch reference and the tuning and the blending to some capacity, more so than you would with just a piano or just a click track. And like Jason was saying, that would be a bit more work in the beginning, but that front loading definitely would pay off in the long run. Like as Jason was saying again, that it made it a lot easier to line up all of the tracks when we had a good and detailed bass track. And it just makes for less frustration, I think, for the musicians. And in the end, it makes your job a lot more realistic and reasonable.
Yeah, and with going off all those points, yeah, it's definitely more useful to have all those things, but also be mindful of the resources that you have at hand, because with everything, not every student's gonna have the access to the devices, and you have to find time to like, do I hand out these devices and recording things to the students? Like, how do I set all that up? Definitely think about all of that before you decide to do it, because it is one of those things like you want to make sure that everything is laid out in front of you before you start getting into doing all of it, because if towards the end it just doesn't work out, then it's a lot of work for a result that probably isn't what you wanted it to be or something that you wanted to present. So we're going off of so choosing the music, how you're setting it up, what the students are listening to, and then even going to that for their video. I think me and Michaela both realize always record the horizontal videos
I
because those can be
have such a
changed.
strong preference to recording like the landscape. So usually people are asked to record on phones. So instead of recording this way, I have found in my vast experience, which is not really that vast, but in my experience so far, recording it horizontally just gives you so much more wiggle room as from the editing side and from the visual side.
Mhm.
So if you have everybody record vertically, then you don't really have much margin space on the left and the right to crop people to make them look like they're about the same size and the same distance from the camera, because we all know it's a little hard to have everybody recorded exactly the same
Mhm.
and just not realistic to expect that from people.
Yeah.
So recording horizontally in my mind makes just a world of difference, and
Yes.
I have a very strong preference for it, and it in the long run makes a lot of things. It makes the final product look cleaner. It gives
Yeah.
you the opportunity to make things more unified and
Mm.
uniform.
Yeah, you get more edit. You have more of a ability to change things and switch up the video
Yeah.
stuff if you do the horizontal video. And then from an audio standpoint, a lot of it will be determined on what recording devices you have and the software that you're using to edit those recording devices. For me, what I've realized is keeping if they have a microphone, having the mic facing where the sound is coming from, so that's in front of them, on their bell, or facing towards their bell, and just trying to get into a room that is, I would say, I prefer personally drier rooms where it's really you can hear the beats all right off the bat, so that it's more concise with keeping time than having a room that is very reverberating. Because when you get to the audio editing, it becomes very difficult to see where notes are if the room is too, I guess, wet is the term. And of course, I am not a
Yeah.
sound engineer of any sort or any music tech, music production major of any sort. Everything that I've learned comes from the experience of people that have taught to me about it, and YouTube, which is a great resource. But definitely keeping your microphone facing towards where the sound is coming out of, and just knowing how much, and definitely always listening back to those recordings so that you know that if you need to pull the mic away because it's getting too much sound and it's not sounding good, or come bring the mic closer so that the volume is the same. And also make sure that there's no background noise. And also that all will also be dependent on how sensitive your microphone is set up to be. But in my experience, definitely try to record in a room that is more dry than it is echoey, or like
Yeah.
yeah,
The less reverb I think is the better. Is that kind of what you're saying?
yeah, like at least for me, because you can add the adding in reverb probably isn't always good,
Right.
but you can add in some of those other things, but you can't change the clarity of the notes. Well, you can, but it's a lot harder to change the clarity and cleanness of the notes when you get into the editing stage. Whereas if the student or the individual that you're working with have all that clarity within a drier space right off the bat, it makes it a little bit easier for the editing side to put everything together or even add effects in as needed.
Yeah, definitely. So while we're on the topic of what we're asking of the musicians recording, we've kind of talked a little bit about the space that they're recording in, and as well as background noise. We want to look out for backgrounds in general. The more plain for most projects, the better, but it depends entirely upon what your vision is. But the more plain the background, the more unified, I guess, in a sense it looks, or just the more similar the background, the better. Since we cannot be in person, then kind of gives the feeling of everybody being together. And we have also touched on the types of tracks and aids we would want to give the people recording to record accurately and just to give them the most space to be very musical. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline necessary, because I know for the last couple of projects that Jason and I did together, probably realistically it took me about 20 hours for each project, and they were pretty different. And one of them, we had another person we were working with as well. Jason, like, about how long does it take you to do any one
Well,
of these?
it's like a project from start to finish. Definitely will take. I think the biggest amount of time, the largest chunk of time, is going to be that recording phase. That's step one of getting the information out to all the students, and then getting all the recordings and videos and audio tracks back into you is definitely the longest stretch of time. And now with the and first, I usually give since I've primarily been working with college students who are music majors, even with their schedules and their ability in playing, I normally give like a month's time to like get everything together. But that also is with music that we haven't rehearsed in person because we just aren't able to. So definitely that beginning step, like give it a full like a good amount of time for either you to work with the students to get the recordings up into shape, or also just so that the students have the ability to learn all the music and then have give them some extra time to get the recordings together. It also gives you some leeway to change anything if needed. So definitely either a month or maybe a 2 months to get all that done, and then I would give like a week of time to get all the videos in, and then a week or two just to get all the videos in, and also just to check up on students or individuals in that group to make sure that the videos are actually in place or where they need to be, and then you can check up and check in with them to make sure that everything is organized. Because once all that is done, once you have everything, the next step of putting it all together from an audio and visual perspective, all that is all dependent on the size or the amount of how much like effect you want to put into the overall thing. Like you're looking for something really complex with a lot of transitions, with a lot of changing shots and whatnot. That's gonna take more time than just having kind of one of those a large like collage
Just a
video of
large
everyone.
grid.
Yeah, type of thing. So definitely be aware of that. But I would say um, the editing normally takes about like a week or two. That's like a week or two of time, or a couple of days if it's like a smaller size project. But definitely give it like overall big timeline wise, like I would give it a couple months to get everything in.
Yeah, definitely. And something I underestimated the first time I did any of these was the amount of time I had to wait for my equipment to keep up and that type of thing because technology is just so advanced, but it can only do so many things at once. So, really giving yourself enough time, giving yourself a lot of leeway in technical difficulties or things like rendering time, just giving yourself a good kind of cushion to whatever you set your end date to be, giving yourself like a lot of time in between there to do the actual editing itself.
Yeah. And giving cushions to all those steps is also very important. So you can always check in with any of the project or any part of the project individually before you had the final product out. And so that Michaela had mentioned is oh my god, I'm blanking on everything. But thinking about wow. I
Just kind of get the technology piece
Yes,
rendering.
technology. Yes. So yeah, so a lot of these projects are dependent on your technology, and with the larger videos and and the editing software that you're using, whether that's the Adobe Suite, GarageBand, or Audacity, or anything like that, or even Windows Movie Maker, all those things, you want to keep in mind that everything keeps up because your computer can only do so much, especially if you don't have a high-end computer or one that's like meant for doing a lot of things at once. You could It will take up time of just doing all that stuff. Sometimes it won't even let you process or render, which is when it gets really scary because then you have to start thinking about, oh, what can I like fix to make it so that it can render? Because I've run into that problem where my computer just wouldn't let me render out or export the final video. So just being aware of that and just giving yourself that room so that you can troubleshoot those things. Um, that's the one thing, like with especially with the conditions and where we are now, technology is so advanced, but it can only do so much, and you have to be aware of what your limitations are with technology. And that really just comes down to both thinking about what you have and what the students have at their disposal to put these things together. But going from, so we currently have like the step one setting up, step two organizing all of it, and then collecting all the videos. There's something that I want to talk about is also how they're sending the videos back in. I think I've experienced using it so that it's just one video and audio, where the students just take a video of themselves playing, and that's going to be your video and audio track. Whereas other times I've also seen people separate the two, so they have a designated audio that they record outside of their video, and then the video track is just them singing again, but maybe with a click track because they're not using that base audio. So you're using that visual aspect and then a separate audio aspect that you just record the audio by itself. And that is kind of just up to you as the organizer of how you want to do it. Definitely having the two separate, so having the one video and one audio is more is in my sense is a little bit better because you have more control on what you're doing with either one of them. Whereas the latter, so I guess the first point that I brought up, which is having the one single video, can get tricky because you can't change all aspects of it. You can still split the two apart, but it's a little bit more difficult to do the nitpicking if is what I think.
Yeah, definitely. And overall, the quality probably increases a little bit if you have the audio and the video recorded separately. The quality of the audio, I mean, because the singers or musicians, I was going to say students, but they're not necessarily students, will have more more space in whatever capacity that entails to record either closer to the mic or often the phone, or really set up the right kind of environment and not have to worry about how they look and not have to worry about getting tangled up in headphones and all these other cords because it's just the audio, and then having them do the video separately. And what I know Jason and I experienced was with a virtual choir, the singers recorded the audio where they had headphones in and were listening to the click track and the accompaniment, and then they recorded a video where the accompaniment was audible in the video so that Jason and I could hear the accompaniment as they were singing, and that kind of made it a little easier to line it up
Hmm.
in the end. So,
Yeah,
those are my
and
two
there's
cents.
yeah, there's are so just figuring out all of that background stuff before you tell them to do anything, so that it's all really clear and laid out for the students, so that when you get that final product of getting all those videos back and those recordings back, that you have all that organized in one place. And speaking of organization, I think Michaela and I have both used Google Drive as the main source of thing where people upload their videos to. So definitely finding out ways to have a space where you can have all this information. I think with Google Drive is probably the easiest because you can make separate folders and people can upload it to the folders as they need to without having to bypass any type of like wall or barrier, unless you don't share the file itself. But I would definitely stick to Google Drive as being that like where you put everything, and maybe even I think it's called Box or like Dropbox type of thing. But
Yeah,
yeah, but I would definitely I would stray towards Google Drive, especially if your school already has a Google Suite like account thing for the district. That makes it a lot easier. And then going off of there, it's just finally that like final editing portion. And we're gonna provide videos and tutorial videos of how to do some of the basic things later on, just to save us from screen sharing all that and the recording crashing. But Michaela, from a video standpoint, like what are some like just tools and programs just to think about when doing any of the video editing?
yeah. So I have by far the most experience with Adobe Premiere Pro and would definitely recommend it, but I have nothing to recommend it against. So that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with any of the other softwares out there. This is just the one that I've found to be very useful. So some of the basic tools you're going to need to know are, well, first of all, you want to get familiar with your interface and just what all of the windows on your screen are, what they mean. So you'll probably have a timeline and you'll have a monitor. You'll have a place where you, like a bin where you take all of the videos from, and then you'll have a little window for the effects or for details on the the clips and the videos and the audio that you're using. But the basics are you drag and drop the videos onto your timeline, and for a virtual choir or a virtual ensemble, you basically have to layer the recordings on top of each other, all lining up. So after you've lined up the audio and the video, then you get to use some fun effects and tools such as crop. Um, then you crop is really the biggest one, so I'm going to spend the most time on that, because once you can crop the videos to the size you want, and you can zoom in and out to make the musicians the distance you want them to be, or fill up the amount of their little box as much as you want them to, then you can move them around the screen and you can totally geek out like I have done and use graph paper to figure out the dimensions that you want everybody to have and that type of thing, and the margins to make sure it's all clean, or you could use rulers on your screen to line everybody up. I've found that the cleaner you can make all the edges and line people up, just the more professional the project looks. And taking that little bit of extra time to really zoom in on your monitor and see if all of the boxes you have just cropped line up or not, that goes a long way. After you've done the basics of you line everything up and you crop everybody and you put everybody next to each other, from there you can add things like transitions or yeah, and you can do the transitions. You can crop them to different sizes and put them on different places on the screen. If you really want to get fancy, you can add some motion with the videos where they're either coming in or coming out or getting bigger, getting smaller. But that's if you're not into this thing, that's way in advance. So basically, your best friend is the crop tool, and you want to get familiar with how to move the musicians around the screen. And from there, everything else is kind of you experiment and you play around with it. You can watch tutorials on how to do all this stuff, like animating the videos to move around the screen and do cool little things like that. And then you could add some transitions in. Mind you, though, that all of these things really add to the size of the project and will take considerably more time the more things like transitions you add in. So yeah, just being mindful of that and what your technology can really handle is going to be key here. But
Yeah,
Jason, what are some of the basics of the
the
audio
audio.
side?
Yeah, so yeah, going off of Michaela's like final point there, like a lot of the audio side stuff will be dependent on the program that you're using and what tools you have at your disposal and how the audio recordings are being made and also the level of technology that you have. Because with audio types of things, if you have like a million tracks, your computer can only play so many, and especially with adding added effects and whatnot, they'll only be able to play so much stuff. So be mindful of that as you get into the editing. But I would say like Michaela, the audio editing tool that I normally use is Audition, which is also an Adobe program, and I've had a lot of success with it and just using it. But GarageBand works very similar to it and has a lot of the same tools, and also even Audacity, one of those like free DOS softwares, also works out really well as well. But I would definitely look at, so once you get all the recordings, the audio recordings compiled into a place, into a space, it's just going through each individual audio track. So when you upload all the audio tracks into Audition or one of your softwares, there should be a section where it's just that bass track by itself. I would definitely just go through and listen to all the tracks a little bit, make sure that there's no like bumps of sound where they're not too loud, because there are tools where you can actually get rid of some background noise. Of course, those effects are very demanding and will sometimes affect the sound quality, so I would definitely skew away from using those very frequently. But also you can also select certain sections of the sound and like bring them down or up in volume or change the entire track volume to a more listenable degree so that all the tracks are relatively at the same volume so that no one track is too loud or too quiet. That's the first step that I would do is just go through all the videos, make sure that there's no immense background noise or any volume that's too quiet or too loud. And then you start making multi-tracks, which are a category of tracks that you can make where you kind of just drag and drop all the individual tracks and you'll start seeing like a large list of all the tracks going down. You can see the wavelengths and all the different colors and whatnot. And the first thing I would do is color code everything, like color coding that if they're
Yeah.
either whether the same section of instruments or same section of voice. So like your soprano, alto, tenor, and basses should all be organized in the same color so that you know the color coordination and the instruments as well. Color coordinating them just makes it a little bit easier to look at, so you know what parts are similar and what parts are different, and what's something new, what's something not. And once you have all that together, all the audio laid out, is the next part is lining up all that audio. And for me at least, it was always easier to find like a couple of lines or instrumental or vocal lines of individual students or singers or players to use as like base marks. So like either using a piano track as your foundation as like a base to line everything up with, and then choosing one person of each section to be like the pivot. So I'm lining up first the piano track with all those pivot points, those individuals that you can probably think of that are like fairly good in tempo and whatnot, and staying together. And getting all those lined up first before working on the large group of individuals. So definitely starting with like a bass track or some type of background that you can use as like the base, and then adding in a couple individuals throughout the entire section of music. So in the case of a choral ensemble, I always choose one soprano, one alto, one bass, and one tenor, one bass to use first. And those are normally the stronger singers in the group, or people that have a cleaner sense of tempo, or maybe it just might be the only one that has something there. So just having all those lined up first, and then using those lined up tracks to line up everything else afterwards. And then for instrumentalists, I always want to have, so if there is a click track, use that click track as like your as your bass, and then I would choose a couple of woodwinds, so like let's say a flute, a clarinet, and like a low woodwind, like a bassoon, or it could be a saxophone, and then choosing a trumpet, horn, and then trombone, and then any type of low brass. If they're not unison, definitely look at the music to find out who those important players are. It becomes more complex once you get into the concert band or orchestral type of literature and string literature, because there are more diverse parts in it. So definitely look over your score and look over the music to make sure that you're choosing the right players to use as your like I said pivot, but as your prime examples of where
Your
time
anchor
your anchor
points.
points. Yes, exactly. So definitely have those all organized out, and then you start layering on top of that. And once you have like the base layout out of where time is, so that it sounds coherent. And what I'd like to do is like once I have everything lined up, listen through the entire thing, and if it sounds like the piece of music that you're performing, that's a good step. That means everything is lined up as best as it is naturally, and then from there you can go into the fine tunings of like doing small cuts in in the individual parts and lining them up more precisely. Of course, with all that, do not cut like larger chunks of time. I always stray to the thing of if they can be lined up, which is like a small shift in the timeline, do it. If it takes a substantial large cut, I would stray away from it. And so once you have all that lined up, the next step is, and some of the more nitty gritty stuff. Next step is effects, and I always like to add in for vocalists um a denoiser, which is essentially just getting rid of some of that background noise. Is one of the effect choices, and you also have a compression, an EQ, and reverb, and all those things are very technical. There's a lot of different terminology. There's the definitions are what they are, but the tools themselves are very complex. There's a lot of ins and outs to all those tools. But a compressor essentially, I have it written down because I cannot remember. It lowers the volume of the louder stuff to the same level as the quieter sound. So essentially, like if you have like large louds but like really quiets, yeah, it compresses them into like to a smaller sound space so that it sounds more full. And then
And
with
the
the
point of that is just like to not like be jarring, right? So if
yeah.
something's like quiet and then all of a sudden it's really loud, you don't have to
Mhm.
change the volume when you're listening to it.
Yeah. And then
Compresses it.
for EQ or equalizers, that also again very complex, a lot of in and outs and a lot of stuff you can do with them. But essentially there's that tool itself allows you to bring out certain right. It allows you to bring out certain sound certain audio points in the music and also reduce certain frequencies, so you can like enhance like the lower frequency and like reduce some of the higher frequencies if you're low like a tenor or a bass part, or if you're playing low brass you might want to get more low frequency than high frequency, or if you're singing an upper part you may want to balance out how much low frequency and how much high frequency that you're getting within the timbre of the individual's voice. And that tool by itself is very complex and there's a lot you can do with it, but I always try to using some of the presets that are within the tool itself, and then if I need to, changing it individually. But once you have all that set up, that's gonna be your final step. And adding reverb is the last thing that I normally do is that echoiness or that fullness of sound. Adding that in, I always like to add milder ones in for instrumentalists and maybe more robust ones for vocalists, just because the voice in the room that you're in usually always doesn't always allow it to be resonant, which is why, like I said earlier, going for drier rooms allows you to have more flexibility with how much reverb that you're doing and much more control with it. So definitely those are the three large categories: is listening to the individual tracks, making sure that everything is cleaned up and that nothing is too loud or too quiet, lining everything up into a multi-track, having a bass track and some anchor points to look out for. And then third step is just adding in those fine details of either splicing certain parts, and then adding in that final those effects that I had mentioned. And like I said earlier, we will provide a video of all those steps in a separate video that we will release um, after this podcast goes up. And we will share that with everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, those are kind of just like the ins and outs and the experiences that Michaela and I have had with working on virtual ensembles, both on the editing side, organizing side, and the participating side of being within those videos. So and like I said, a lot of it is just it comes down to the tools that you have at your disposal, being aware of what your students have at their disposal, and just choosing music that fits within and is doable realistically within those within all of that. So definitely choosing that music is like the most crucial part because you don't want to choose something that's too complex to put together, but you also don't want to choose something that's like way too simple. Well, maybe you could, but it kind of is up to you and what you want to present because there are lots of limitations with the virtual ensemble thing that can be mediated with a lot of technology. But also, if you choose something simpler, you can put together something that sounds nice and looks nice, especially during our COVID times where we can't perform together. Putting something together
Yeah.
may just be nice to have just in general.
Yeah, definitely something um, that will highlight your musicians in a way where taking into account the complexity of using the devices they have to use now, um, something that maybe doesn't push them as much with new musical concepts as much as it can highlight what they're able to do with the addition of having to work the technology into it.
Yeah. That's just something fun to do, something fun to learn. As what I've realized, I spent the majority of the summer coming into the fall semester working on it and learning the tools because it was something that I've always been interested in. And with the pandemic and whatnot, having to be at home and still wanting to be creative and put projects together, learning those tools and organizing these small like performances was always like just fun. It was just something that helped me stay creative and help the individuals that I worked with stay creative and still perform at some capacity with one another without having to risk any health provisions. But that's gonna kind of wrap up our first section, which is talking about the virtual ensemble. And there's a lot of stuff. There are probably thousands of resources out there that can help you set them up. But this is primarily just Michaela and I's perspective and our experience working within those settings. And like I said earlier, we will provide some tutorials and some videos that we put together on how to get started and how to organize them later on after this podcast. But before we wrap up, I kind of wanted to just, this is our final episode of season one of Lines and Spaces. I kind of want to do like a quick wrap up of like everything that we talked about and the things that Michaela and I have learned doing this podcast and hopefully encouraging you, the listener, to start thinking about as like a if you are a music educator or an educator or a musician in general, some things to think about, some takeaways with having a podcast or doing a podcast or the information that we learned or the research and the all the ins and outs of organizing the podcast itself. So Michaela, as like a quick wrap up, what I guess is your largest takeaway of doing lines and spaces?
Well, there have been several takeaways, Jason, and I think one of them is kind of learning how to be specific and concise in what I want to communicate about the topics we're on. And Jason and I usually have a meetup before we record in which we go through things that we want to touch on and important points, and then have that loose format and then go into recording and just as you've seen and heard just have a conversation all the way through, so making sure that you have whatever notes you need and doing that extra little bit of research and knowing what the point is that you want to get across, I think are some pretty useful things that I've learned from this. But what about you, Jason?
I'm definitely in that same boat. I think I use this podcast, kind of the whole thing itself, to organize myself and to speak coherently and to slow down my like public speaking skills. Even though we're not really talking to like an audience live, it has helped me to do research and communicate points more directly and more coherently than I have been in the past, where I would just like I knew the idea, but I would kind of just ramble through a bunch of stuff, and it normally never comes out. But it's yeah, and that's the same idea as like we talk about teacher talk a lot, which is like thing like where teachers kind of ramble just because they they don't really know what to do, or they just like feel like
Fill the space.
yeah, fill the space in with talking. But I think with these podcast type things, or any type of like recording or video type of thing, it helps just like reduce that time of thinking about what you're about to say and having to ramble to get through something. So definitely this podcast has helped me kind of fix some of those issues that I had in the past of kind of just like looking at information and not being able to precisely indicate what the information is saying is saying, or giving direct feedback, or not giving specific feedback in general. Another big point that I kind of took away with just this first season and the topics that we've touched on is just how much information that there is about music education and the research of music education, and the wide array of like things and topics that are just within music education itself, and also music itself. Learning about like classroom management, or the care ethics, and also some of the more scaffolding and whatnot, and just looking at the research that's currently available through NAFME, and all the essays and the reports that are being written, and the studies happening, which just kind of like enlightened me to think about music in different ways, and start like trying new ways to teach music and incorporate music within my own life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a lot of information, and it kind of shows that this field that we're in is always adapting and always like changing, and that we can never be you can be satisfied with where you're at, but never be afraid to like try something new or learn something new within the field that you're in, even if you've been teaching for many years. Because with this podcast, we've had the ability to speak with many professionals in the field, talk with others within our pre-service field about their experiences, and also just outside of it, I've been able to use it as a way of communicating with like long time teachers in the public field, public school field, about their own applications and how they manage a classroom. And it allows you to think more precisely and more clearly about the larger goals of what music education is.
Definitely.
All right, Michaela, here's the big question now. Out of all the 8 episodes that we've done, or I guess this is episode 8, so 7 episodes that we've done, which one do you think is like has been like one of like the discussions where you enjoyed the most, or a topic that you were very interested in?
That's tough. I enjoyed the precision we were able to have with this one because it it was such a tangible thing. It's video editing that's pretty. Um, it's not super conceptual. It's all right there. But something that I find very important is the conversation that we got to have, I think, towards the beginning, just about the way that as an educator you view your role and you view um, the relationship that you are to have with your students, which is one that allows the students to know that they're cared about and one that motivates them to want to learn. I think that lies at the foundation of teaching. So to me, that was probably my favorite conversation we got to have.
Yeah,
And
that's
you?
no, that one is also definitely up there on mine. Like it's one of like the biggest themes that I've learned as a pre-service educator, and also being in the field and having taught, is that communication and care, and how you communicate with your students, and how you organize your environment, and those discussions that we've had about that, I think are some of like the key foundational roles to setting up your classroom and your teaching for success and well into the future. Um, those are very important topics. Something like I really enjoyed having was just the discussions where we got to invite other people in to hear their perspective. Because I think sometimes, like though Michaela and I both have a lot of experience and a lot of great ideas and a lot of like thoughts, it can become very like we are very unique individuals, but we only have so much information and so much perspective on the things that we've learned. And just introducing those guests and having those people come in and talk about what they've experienced, and the topics of research that they've had is was kind of eye opening, kind of seeing like what it's like from someone else's perspective, what someone else may incorporate within their teaching, and how I can think about that and also include that into my own personal development and teaching. So I think we had two episodes with special guests this season. That was one with we talked about college application and all that prep stuff, the auditions and whatnot, and also the one that we had, I think our last episode where we had with Dr. Cates about um gender inclusivity in the music classroom and the language surrounding that. I think both of those podcasts or those discussions kind of opened up my thoughts on things and how I was as a teacher, and how kind of music kind of meant to me and like the steps that I took to achieve the things that I've done, and also things that I can think about in the classroom and how I can apply myself in those settings.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are kind of like the larger topics. And it's been a lot of fun doing this podcast with Michaela and also the guests that we've had, and also communicating with our audience about the different things and the things that we've learned, because it is such a large field, and also one that kind of is so odd, because you come I from at least for both our perspectives, you come in with an idea of what music education is, and then you come out the
Hmm.
other side either still having that same base idea, or having a new perspective like, oh, music education is much more than just teaching music by itself. It's a field that
Right.
is constantly expanding, and one that is crucial in our own development as individuals, is having that artistic choice and having music be that be an important part of our lives just in general.
Yeah, definitely.
So with all of that, Michaela, do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
I think you wrapped it up beautifully, Jason.
Well, that will conclude our last episode of season one of Lines and Spaces. I again want to say thank you to everybody for listening. It's always fun to see people respond back and give us like replies and reviews on these things, so we can better ourselves in our communication and with the podcast itself. And yeah, we will. We're gonna sign off now. I hope everybody stays well and safe throughout these times, and we will be back when we're done student
Soonish.
teaching, because Michaela and I will both be very busy with our final semester of school
Yes.
for the time being. So, thank you so much again for everybody, and we will catch you next time.